So what would it be like if we became good news people and good news was the central defining core of who we were as a church community? Yesterday we talked about five principles, 5 thoughts, 5 steps we could take to be a church that thrives in the midst of a pandemic. And as a pandemic is hopefully winding down, there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's always going to be the case. So, but the question is, what could we be? What steps could we do? How could we be the kind of church that thrives in this time? And the 5th step, the 5th thing that I talked about was that a church that thrives in this time is a church that is unified based on mission. And that means the mission of God, Missio Dei. The mission of God, if you remember, according to the Johannine Corpus, is to make all things new. God looks at a broken world and a broken people, and he wants to make them all new. And so one of the big things that I think we've lost in the modern current church is we've lost sight of our main focus, our main mission, and that we used a term called feature creep or mission creep yesterday. And basically we were talking about how often, sorry I kicked my stand there, how often it happens that a company or a movement or an institution or a people set out to do one thing, but then they get sidetracked by all these other things that they think might improve the thing that they're doing. And so it happens a lot in automobile manufacturing. So imagine you made just an amazing, luxurious car, and you have a wonderful sound system, and you've got a really wonderful heater that basically is warm as soon as it kicks on, even in negative 20-degree weather. Imagine you had a capability to do all these things, and you've got a seat heater, and you've got cup holders that keep a beverage hot or cold. You've got all these features, but you forgot to put an engine in the thing. Your car completely loses the point of being a car if you've got all these features, but you lack the mission. And that is what I think we've done a little bit when it comes to defining what unifies us as church communities. And we talked about all these different ways that seem good to us at the time, but they're not the greatest good. And the greatest good is to proclaim the kingship of Jesus. And so what happens is we start to let other things become the main thing, and we forget what the main thing is. And I would argue that in a lot of ways, the reason that the feature creep has happened in the church is that we have not adequately understood or allowed ourselves to live into this mission, which is a mission to proclaim the kingship of Christ. And so a church that thrives is a church that is unified on the mission, and then we recognize that all these other things, they are secondary. And what has happened, because we have not been defined based on our mission, is we've defined our unity based on all these secondary things that may be very important, things like theology, doctrine. Doctrine is an incredibly important part of what it means to be a follower of Christ. But doctrine is not what defines the kingdom. If it was, Jesus would have given the 12 doctrinal statement when he sent them out. When he first sent them out preaching, he said, just go. Here's the message. The kingdom of God is at hand. That wouldn't fly today, because we would all say, well, whose kingdom? And what do you mean? Do you mean a pre-dispensational kingdom, or do you mean a post-rapture? And we would throw all this jargon in, and if Jesus, the argument I come back to over and over again is if that was so central to the message, then Jesus would have included that in his instructions. But because he didn't, we ought to recognize that while those things are an important conversation, they are not the conversation. We would say, well, who would Jesus be? He sends these disciples out. Who would they be campaigning for while they were going out? Which presidential candidate would they be supporting? And I would imagine Jesus would say, they just support the true king. And yeah, they may end up voting, I don't know, but they hold that pretty loosely because they know that the kingdoms of this world are temporary. They're not the main thing. And so as churches, we've had this feature creep, and these things have started to define us and we believe unify us, but it's a false sense of unity because our true unity ought to be based on the king we proclaim and the mission of proclaiming that king. So working backwards, we had these 5 principles, and I think they all contribute to the mission at hand. So the 5th principle was a church that thrives in this time is a church that is defined, that defines its unity based on the mission of God. The 4th principle is a church that thrives is a church that allows itself to recognize that there is no perfect church. And so Jesus sent him out and he said, hey, proclaim the kingdom of God is at hand. Now that's not a perfect message. That's not a conclusive, it's not an all nuanced, all encompassing. It doesn't say everything that needs to be said because that's impossible. And we live in a world of criticism and critique. And you know, I stand by this statement. You could do the most benevolent thing you could possibly do for someone, and then someone else will come along and say, well, you didn't do that for everybody, so if you don't have cake for everybody, you shouldn't have cake. And it's such a strange world we live in. It's okay for some people to have cake sometimes. We can't possibly fix everything at once, and no fix is perfect. And so a church that thrives and moves forward in this time is a church that allows itself to do things even when they're not perfect. 4th principle was a church that would thrive in this time as a church that gives up on perfect church. The 3rd principle is a church that thrives in this time as a church that throws wide the gates of grace. And this is very related to me, to the concept of letting go of this perfect idea we have of church and ourselves. Throwing wide the great gates of grace means Jesus welcomed us into his family based on grace. So a lot of times, though, we have gatekeeping for that, and we say, well, Jesus may have had grace on everyone, but is that really what we're supposed to do? But what if their sin is really bad? What if so yeah, we're all sinners, but what if they say a really bad word in our worship service? Or what if they don't dress the way we want them to? What if they don't look the way we want? What if they sin in very different ways than we do? And I'm not, again, we live in this world of criticism and critique. I'm not saying we let go of the concept of sin, and I'm not saying we tell everybody that every sin is okay. What I am saying, though, is we make it abundantly clear that belonging is not based on sin or lack of sin or sinning appropriately. Belonging is based on the call and the goodness and the grace of Jesus Christ. And so if we want to be a church that thrives in this time, we would emphasize that grace as we allow people to live imperfect parts of our church. So that was the 3rd principle. A church that thrives will throw wide the gates of grace. The 2nd principle is a church that will thrive in this time is a church that hears and embraces a world in pain. The world's been on fire, and you know, I can't adequately address the issue. And so I would strongly encourage you to find and to listen to the groups that feel ignored in our time and listen to them about those issues. Don't listen to me. I have a pretty comfy life, you know. Listen to people that are hurting and hear from them. Why do you hurt? What can I do to help? And to hear someone else's pain is not to say that you don't have your own pain. It's just to exhibit compassion. We need more of that in our world, and you know, if ever people would feel like they were heard, I would hope it would be at Christian Fellowship Church. So the 2nd principle was that a church that thrives in this time is a church that will embrace and hear the pain of our world. And the 1st principle, and this is I mean, this may be the starting point, is that a church that thrives in this time is going to listen to the best preacher, and the best preacher is and remains Christ himself. This is about him, and it's not about me, and it's not about what I'm doing. And my message, my goal is to point toward him. And so, like the author of Hebrews, I would echo, let us fix our eyes on Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith. If we lose sight of that, that's where all the mission creep comes in. We've started to believe, because we're not listening to the very best preacher, we've started to believe all the preachers we do listen to. And that's this idea that that perhaps politics will finally fix everything. Perhaps if we just get everybody to vote exactly the right way, then the world will be fixed. Or perhaps if we just post the right thing on Facebook, we will save all these horses before they go and get turned into meat. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but there's a thing going around that horses are going to be slaughtered because of coronavirus. It's not, I don't think it's true. But we've started to believe all these other things are fixing the world when what the world needs is its rightful king to fix it. And if we want to be part of that solution, we have to listen to the rightful king. And we've got these 4 books in our Bible, and they may be the most straightforward, easy parts of the Bible to read. So we should read those more than you listen to me, and more than you listen to internet preachers, and definitely more than you listen to political pundits. These Gospels are the breath of life for a dying world, and they're the breath of life for you and for me. So church, let's be the kind of church that thrives. We may be in the middle of a pandemic. We may be near the end of a pandemic. I don't know. I don't science all the time. And, even the scientists are struggling to figure out exactly what's right and wrong right now. But we have confidence that Christ is king, that he sits on the throne, and that he can and will and wants to use us to do his work in this world. So let's go do it. We'll see you soon, church.